I'm just going to do a brief little talk about how I got to be here. And this is a marriage quilt made by my grandmother Hunt. And both my grandmothers were daughters of pioneers and quilt makers and knitters. So I like to think I come by the craft part of my personality and my practice honestly. It was inbred and from when I was a little girl. I lived in Winnipeg when I went to art school, and after I went to art school I stayed in Winnipeg, and above the Wynn in Winmore, that was my studio. So I lived in my studio to be able to afford to be an artist. This is an early show I had in Winnipeg in the 80s called Never Trust a Hippie. You can see how I'm using sculpture, installation, a little bit of fabric even then. This is another exhibition called Shrapnel, and it didn't really have to do with war, but here I am making work about war all these years later. This had to do with gender, so a big interest I had in the 1980s and into the 90s was gender. So there's one part of the gallery that was male, on the other side it was collections of fabric and, that were about I called it the Boys Club, and then on the left it was all about women, and in this middle there was a bed with a woman's figure full of broken glass. This is from the show A Dress, curated by Shirley Medill in Winnipeg. And when I went to grad school, I worked in the fibers area, and I started cutting out steel in dress shapes, and sometimes using lace, but often using motifs from nature. So I was kind of playing with the idea of nature and women being thought of as being close to nature. And these steel dresses are about 7 feet high, and I made them as high, like for me, a short woman to look up to a man, the average height of a man. I wanted men to come and look at it as if with the same proportions, so they would have to look up at these big, strong steel women. So that was the idea. And then I moved to Newfoundland. I got a job in Newfoundland, which was wonderful. It's such a beautiful place to live. This is in Salvage. And you'll see on the right-hand side on that little piece of land sticking out that there's a little white picket fence cemetery. So my father had been killed in a bicycle accident, and I was grieving the death of my father. So that's got me interested in issues of death. And what I was doing was knitting little squares, and I was doing this obsessively because it made me feel better. And I wasn't sure, does everybody when they grieve do something repetitive? I'm not sure, but I think lots of us do. And I learned later that repetition is soothing. And this is a show at Ace Art that I came back to Winnipeg to do this show, and it was about death, and I did all this work about the death of my father. So that first piece, it's called Cluster Aureole Nebula, and the first piece is the moment of death when the body disintegrates. And then the second one is that empty space in your life that person used to be. So there's this empty space. You want to talk to them, but they're not there. And then there's the nebula, and I have this image of our spirit going to the stars after we die. So that was the best image I could come up with for what happens to us after we die. As well in Newfoundland, I found lots of fabric flowers. And I'd been picking up fabric flowers from outside graveyards for a long time because they felt lost, and I knew they had been brought to the grave with love. And the wind would blow them all out into the field, and I would bring green garbage bags and fill them up with flowers from out in the field. And then I would take them home and take them apart and wash them and care for them and make installations out of them. And this is one installation that was in Newfoundland, and I did a whole bunch of things, glued them to walls, hung them from ceilings, and I'm still not finished with this work because I love these so much. They're faded, and I love the beauty of the fading and the worn edges. I was very fortunate to get a Canada Council Paris studio, and the building, there's 2 trees on the left of that bridge, and between the trees you can see that great big building, and that's the Cité Internationale des Arts in Paris. And I was lucky to have a studio that looked out over the Seine, and it was an amazing experience. And I was lucky when I was there, they had the Pyramid of Shoes. And the Parisians bring a pair of shoes tied together in solidarity with people who've lost a limb due to landmines. And I learned about landmines, and I had knitted a rifle, and I thought I would knit landmines. And so I started making a few in Paris where war seemed really real. I make these are different kinds of landmines. I found out there's about 300 different kinds. I've made about 100. So it's a lifetime project. And I try to make them as accurately as possible to kind of diminish any idea, you know, of the nature of a toy or something like that. So try to make it really accurate. And I thought I would show you the last one I made, which is a replica of an IED, one kind of an IED that's being used in Afghanistan that's killing our soldiers. So the piece in the front, the light pink, is 2 pieces of plywood with 2 saw blades in the middle, and there's a rubber casing over it, so it gets buried in the road, just under the surface of the road. So when the truck or the tank drives over it, it pushes the 2 pieces of plywood together, the metal makes contact, and then the battery there creates power, which goes into and sets off a Russian missile that's inside. In this case, I knitted a sandbag, which everybody here knows what they look like. And, but they will use a sandbag, they will use a plastic shopping bag, they'll use whatever to kind of disguise what's going on. And of course the battery would be inside the bag, but I put it outside so people could see it. From there, I started working with the idea of the preciousness of the human body, the preciousness of the soldier's body. So this is like 3 years of embroidery, trying to get that, trying to deal with taking care. And I started working more with camouflage fabric. This is the seams from different camouflage uniforms. And this piece is about 24 feet wide by about 12 feet high, something like that. So it's really big, on a big wall. So it's about the very simple idea that war is everywhere in the world. And that comes from Paul Virilio. He wrote about how once you have a standing army, you have a war economy, so everything around us, our clothes, the chairs, everything has some connection to war, unavoidably. With the camouflage that's being worn in Afghanistan, I thought, how do I return the camouflage to nature? And I decided to make little stones. So I made thousands of these little stones. It's like really, it's crazy making work. So these are squinched up newspaper, and it's just very low tech, very simple, and just pieces of fabric dipped in glue and water and wrapped around the newspaper to make stones. This is the last piece I made, and these images are from a show I had at the Room. So I did this piece, it's called Constellation, and I was given boxes of uniforms that Canadians wore in Bosnia because they were so worn, the store couldn't sell them. And anyway, so I got them, so the fabric is all worn, and I cut out the uniforms, and these are people who sew will recognize some of the pieces. There's bits of arms and legs and stuff like that. And when even saying that, I feel like I'm talking about the bodies, because there's one for each Canadian soldier that died in Afghanistan, so it's kind of my memorial to them. And what I did was I took the image from a Newfoundland shroud, and this may be the only hand-cut shroud that exists in the world. In England, they used to hand-cut shrouds, and it was something that people who didn't have very much money would do. They would take an ordinary household sheet and cut out these intricate designs to kind of look like lace. And what I did was I cut out one flower from each piece of the uniform, and when I put it on the wall, it was like these flowers made this big, like stars in the sky, and it reminded me of, you know, my idea of death. And I think this might be the last of the little tour of Barb's art. So it's like a miniature artist talk. So you kind of know where I'm coming from and who I am and what kind of work I do.